Now that we've generally talked about attacking web servers, let's get a little bit more specific and talk about some of the attacks that can be waged against a web server. Now, obviously, since it is just a server, it's vulnerable to several attack vectors just like all the other servers, whether they're DNS servers, email servers, or even file servers. Unfortunately, though, web servers have the added vulnerability of being accessible from the internet by all manner of hackers. Now, web server attacks not only target the physical box itself and the network that it's running on and the operating system that's on the system, but also the web server software itself and any applications that are used to host the website. And when we talk about web server software, we're really talking about the two big players in the field, some form of Apache and Microsoft's Internet Information Server. Now, there are other ones out there, obviously, but the market is pretty much led by those two pieces of software, Apache and IIS. So obviously a lot of the attacks are targeted directly for them. Now, the attacks against web servers pretty much follow the same methodology that you could use against other types of hosts. And we're talking servers and workstations and other network devices. So you would still footprint and enumerate a web server. Now, first you would footprint it using some standardized and some specialized tools. Obviously, the standardized tools would be things like the Whois, DNS footprinting, and some of the other footprinting methods we've talked about. Some of the specialized tools might include something like Netcraft, for example, and we're going to talk about Netcraft a little bit later. Then you would enumerate the techniques to get information about users, any services, configuration information, OS patches, and so forth. Again, the whole reason you're getting this information is to figure out your attack vectors, to find the vulnerabilities and decide that those vulnerabilities are the ones you want to go after. Then you would switch your targeting to system attacks. In other words, you would go after the system itself, possibly the operating system and its configuration, the web server software itself, or the applications. So you may be looking for weak passwords, missing patches, that may allow a vulnerability to be exploited that doesn't take care of a vulnerability, flaws in the operating system, and so forth. If you find open shares or open directories, or you're otherwise able to, you might, as a hacker, even install malware on the system. And this might be things like a keystroke logger or a malicious script, for example, that would delete the website, or any manner of other things you can install on there, Trojans and so forth. And you might use this to infect the server and its applications so that it prevents the server from working properly, or it spreads malware throughout the network. Now, you also have these network attacks you could launch against the server, and this might result in a denial of service condition, and something like that might be ICMP attacks or SYN floods or something of that nature, if the administrator has not hardened the OS and the network against those types of attacks. You also see a really popular attack, and that's DNS hijacking. And that involves changing the DNS entries for a web server, or polluting a cache such that users may go to a different website, one that you've set up. So there are all kinds of different network attacks you could wage against that box also. You could also look at application attacks, and we're going to talk about those later on in the course. That actually is the topic of the second half of this particular chapter. And applications attacks target the website itself and the database services. And the goal might be to access data, to get it, to steal it, or even change it. You also might have website defacement in mind as a goal if you're a hacker. So there's all these different attacks that you could wage, and a lot of them are the same as other types of servers. There are other types of attacks that you could wage against the web server that might be a little bit unique to web services. Directory transversal attacks is a popular one. And that's basically when you can put in some malicious type of entry into the URL to cause HTTP to freak out and actually backtrack from the directory that stores the HTTP web content into the operating system's directories. There's also obviously buffer overflow attacks that you could use against the operating system and the web server applications. Privilege escalation attacks. Frequently, you are allowed to log on to a web server using simple credentials, or even anonymously, and there may be flaws in the configuration that might allow you to escalate privileges to get administrative level or root level privileges over that box. And we've already mentioned the TCP/IP types of attacks, scans, ICMP attacks, SYN floods, and so forth. There's also a couple of attacks that are definitely unique to a web server, and that would be like the HTTP split response attack and the response hijack attack. And basically those involve masquerading as a user and sending malformed HTTP requests so that the response will be split. So the web server thinks it's replying back to the client, but it's replying back to you, and you're kind of the man in the middle there. And you would do this in order to basically get a client to send credentials and then have the response sent back to you. And there are different variations of these two attacks as well. SSL attacks would mean that you are trying to target the SSL, the secure communication session, either by exploiting a certificate that's been compromised or expired or self-generated or some other kind of weakness in the SSL. And that brings me to talking about session hijacking. That's another type of attack that you would wage against the web server in particular, because you might hijack the session, hijack credentials, and both the client and the server think they're talking to each other, but they're talking to you. And that's very similar also to a man-in-the-middle attack. And we've already mentioned as well different password and authentication attacks that you obviously could use against a particular web server or web services that run on that server. So there's all kinds of attacks out there. Now, in the next couple of sessions, we're going to look at some of the tools you would use to wage some of these attacks.